de 4 första session. Då... Ja, de är fem. Yes. Stänger av mitt ljud på telefonen.
En båda. Um, but welcome everyone to this roundtable. We're going to do today on resilience, whatever that means. I guess this is why we're here, right? So before we start, I thought it'd be good to do a quick introduction. You've seen me before, and we've mingled around. Maybe start on that end. If you just give your name, what you do, and what you hope to get out of this roundtable.
Okay, my name is Lily Heinrichs. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. I'm based out of Geneva right now, working with Northern and Central Europe and with the local Red Cross and Red Crescents in the region to see how we can partner together and address some of these concerns related to volunteers. What I hope to get out of this roundtable is I know that there's a certain responsibility that individuals have, and volunteers and staff members as individuals for the organizations that they work for and in meeting the needs of the communities that they're trying to serve. But there's also a responsibility on the organization and to see where is there a gap in that responsibility and how we can address that gap.
Great.
Good morning. My name is Michael Ayabe, and I work with the Kenya Red Cross Society as a regional manager covering the Rift Valley. So I take like all the tasks that, of course, the National Society undertake at that level. And for today's conference, my expectation really is that we're able to get to and see the mechanism we could have in place of being that society, that or organization that is always present in the first instant when and possibly there's need for help, and sustaining that over time despite the challenges that the volunteers and staff always face on ground. And that is to say that then how do we make sure that they will not get tired and say, at least no, not this time round, I don't want to be part of it. We want to have a situation where all the time our volunteers want to be part of what's happening and they sustain the capability.
Morning, everybody. My name is Maggie Carroll. I work for United Nations Volunteers in the headquarters in Bonn, Germany. Our organisation, part of our mandate is to promote volunteerism with UN member states, primarily with governments. One of my projects is I'm working on the State of the World's Volunteerism report. It's a report that comes out every 3 years, and our next one comes out in 2018, and it's on the theme of resilience.
Wow.
So, so I'm hoping that this panel will do some of my homework for me, because we look at, I'll talk about it, but we look at volunteerism very broadly as a universal social behaviour, but part of our research has been with the movement, and I think will be really interesting to get slightly more concrete about some of the recommendations that you have for how we can support resilient volunteerism. Yeah.
Great.
Hi, I'm Janet Clark. I'm a research and evaluation specialist for health at VSO, but I'm here with a sort of more generic VSO hat on. VSO, formerly known as Voluntary Service Overseas, but we're not allowed to call ourselves that anymore. We're just VSO. So you still have to explain who we are and what we do, but then we are VSO. I'm based in London. As an organisation, we work with a range of different volunteers. So we've got a long history of being an organisation that works with international volunteers, but much more now, we work with local volunteers as well and community volunteers. And we have quite a strong track record of south-to-south volunteering. So I'm particularly interested in resilience because it's a thing that we are starting to look at in more detail and articulate more in our organisation. I think there are things that we've been doing for a long time that do support resilience, but we are now verbalising it and articulating it much more and starting to think about how we can work more in humanitarian context.
That's great. I mean, you might have picked up that there's a number of different voices and organizations that have been picked up around this roundtable. although in my head, when I thought of round table, I was thinking a big, giant round table in the middle with everyone around us cheering different sides, but then we have 2 coffee tables, but that's okay. But yeah, so there's a number of different voices being represented here, and I guess the key question everyone's thinking of is, what does everyone mean by resilience, you know? So I'd be interested in, hearing, what do you mean by resilience when you use that word? So anyone can start.
I'll start.
Okay.
Okay. I think we don't know what we mean by resilience, if I'm really honest, because we've just started talking about it, and we've had some very interesting discussions talking about supporting our country offices to work in more resilient ways, supporting communities to deal with crises more. But also, I think there's something very important about resilience of individual volunteers. And I heard something yesterday, I can't remember where it was, talking about you cannot have resilient communities without having resilient individuals. So obviously the role that volunteers play and supporting their resilience in that process is a really important thing. So as an organisation, we're talking more about resilience in a programming sense, but I think we have to remember that volunteers are a central part of everything we do at VSO, so their resilience is crucial.
Anyone have anything to add to that? Michael?
I think you would look at maybe 2 perspectives. One is, of course, every other time we talk about building resilient communities, which basically mean a community that is able to spring back and continue with life despite the disaster issues and emergencies that so arise. And then, if that is the case, then when you come to the volunteers, and we are talking about a resilient volunteer, would also use the same scale and say you want a volunteer then that is able to spring back and take action. If you recall the discussion we had yesterday, then there was, I'm sure, the bit that we also talked about the volunteer being a victim. And therefore, if you can talk about a volunteer being a victim, then you can actually also have the same volunteers being affected by a disaster or an emergency within the areas that they come from. But at the end of it, despite that happening, then you still need someone that would be able to rise up above the situation and help others. Because the levels of impact would not be the same. And so what we would actually be looking at is what qualities of volunteers would we need to have so that even when there are challenges, as I said earlier, they are able to come up and continue to do what they do. And that, for me, they will really need to be grounded, one, within the community where they are. And I would like to maybe look at how IFRC has previously put in the formations of community-based disaster response teams, community-based disaster response units, so to say that the community always has an organization within itself. And that, of course, you talk about the community organization that has individual volunteers. So if they are jointly able to always support one another and be there, then we can talk about a resilient team of volunteers. Yeah.
It's interesting because you're also adding a layer of care for the volunteer itself, because often the language around resilience is about individuals, communities, national or global, but where do volunteers fit into that? It's often missing from the conversation, isn't it?
For sure.
And I think it's around volunteers. What builds that resilience also is knowing that the organization has their back. That if they're acting in a way that has the appropriate behaviors and they have the trainings and skills that they're required, that they know that the organization will provide the duty of care, will be able to define the threshold of risk. So it's not up to the individual to decide, okay, do I do this, that there's a structure around them that gives them that support. And that we do everything in our power to prevent and reduce injury or loss of life that could affect that could that the volunteers and staff can encounter, because this work is not risk-free. There's always a level of risk, but what we have a responsibility to define that level of risk and to look at clear decision making, who makes those decisions, who has the roles and the responsibilities and the accountability for those decisions as well, so that that whole lattice of structure that supports that volunteer is there as much as possible.
One of the questions for the roundtable was around how many of the volunteers talk about individuals and their families, but hardly any talk of organizational structure, or the sense that the organization doesn't have their back in one sense. Just, I guess, is arguing from absence, but the absence does speak volumes, doesn't it? Does anyone want to add anything to the questions, the many questions that Lily has raised?
I think for me, working on resilience, we talk about resilience in the context of systems, and this idea of diversity, so having different levels of actors within a system, being able to balance that risk effectively through different phases, whether it's preparations or absorbing shocks and stresses, or to transform and adapt. And I think what was really interesting about yesterday's discussions was that, in a way, the jump from the from individual maybe to community to higher levels of institutions, but we have this kind of black box around an organisational level. And I think certainly from what I've been reading, we haven't unpacked that black box at all about what are the different levels within organisations and where is a lot of that risk absorbed. So I think you're absolutely right, Lily, in terms of what you say, and I think what we discussed yesterday fits very well into that. And I think if risk isn't balanced effectively over time, obviously capacities are eroded, so whether that's through burnout or people really struggling to also juggle the different elements of risk that they're facing in their roles as volunteers or as family members. So I think what we need is, resilient volunteerism that supports the resilience of communities. And for us, it's almost about finding an optimal point to work towards, where we're really drawing on what are the distinctive and very positive aspects of volunteerism, rather than maybe some of the more exploitative aspects. But that's a kind of long-term ideal that we need to work towards. So
would you like to expand more on the distinction between them?
Yeah, so I think in our research, where we were looking very generally at volunteerism, so we weren't just looking at, for example, Red Cross, Red Crescent, although they were present, we asked communities what they really what they saw as what was different or special about the work that volunteers were doing in comparison with other actors working on resilience. And there were, very positive aspects about, speed, availability, accessibility, local knowledge, understanding of problems. But on the other hand, volunteers and of all types, and I would say the vast majority of the examples that we were given were about local and relatively informal volunteerism. But that volunteerism could be exploitative, so whether that was organisations transferring risk very much down to the local level, or whether it very much reinforced traditional gender roles, for example. So there could be quite exploitative, quite unequal, even within communities. Communities are not homogenous. So I think the idea was, okay, in the reality, in the face of shocks and stresses, of course some of this will happen, but how can volunteerism actually interact with the context to work a bit more towards actually what's really valuable about volunteers, whether it's organisations, governments and others, valuing the positive and working to address some of the negative aspects of the interaction between volunteering and resilience. Yeah.
Great. Do you want to add something?
Well, just picking also from that and building on what Lily had mentioned earlier, is that, one, we talk about resilience, and we cannot talk about this resilience without looking at the capacities at various levels. For one, For sure, and we really need to build those capacities because, as you see, just to look at the national societies, the Red Cross roles and responsibilities are increasing by the day, just the way we have many disaster incidences that are occurring. So is the need. And if you look at many countries, then the Red Cross have been given a mandate, most often than not underpinned in the country's law. And the laws, I don't think, will change that then you have this particular mandate to deliver this service. So what we have, the options we have then is to make sure that we are up to the task by building the capacities of these volunteers in order that they are able to stand at any one particular time. And so when of course, I mentioned earlier about, the community-based disaster units and having that presence at the lowest level at any one particular time. And be aware that these volunteers and families will always have needs. Unless you satisfy their needs first, then you may not really be able to engage them effectively. And I'm looking at even small things. I mean, my perspective is, learning from home experience, where healthcare is not, easily available and is not free. But we encourage them to get the cover that is a national provided cover, but not everyone is able to get access information on how they can be paying their monthly subscriptions. In Kenya, we have the National Hospital Insurance Fund. So we encourage them individually to make sure that they are registered there. For those who are working, or even if they are in the informal works, they register with the social security services, so that they have something. Even when they age, you will always, because most of them, this is home for them. And you always want to have them there. And you can imagine, every other time they have a small hitch relating to health, a small hitch relating to just normal life, they will always look at you. And when you have enabled them to be able to get these covers, then to some extent, you only come to supplement or provide additional information or guide them. So we need to be thinking about how do we help them to build those capacities, including helping them to set up small income-generating activities, or setting structures that they have something that they own in common, that binds this. We just need to find a way of binding the volunteers together in a positive way, that always there's something they are able to identify with, something that puts, group A and B in relationship, and therefore every time you need to engage them, whether individually or as a group, they are not strangers. And you will see that because it's a place that this is their home, then we are going to build a culture of, my dad used to be a volunteer here, and they are always saying, my son, this is the truck. And mine, so it's going to be transformed into a culture where this is transferable from one generation to another. It might not be easy, but I would say one of the communities that we worked with in the informal settlements, where we thought initially that these people, after you've done this, after some time they will move. Some will move, but majority of them remain there. And it's now, I think, since we started the Urban Resilience Project, is about 6 years, 7 years now. And the children that we engage at the primary level, who were then in class 5 and 6, are now graduates. And what they learned from that unit, they are coming back to give. And so what I wanted to say is that we need to build this culture. We need to always consider that you build their capacities in various direct dimensions, not necessarily always thinking like these people need to be providing first aid service, so you train them on first aid services. Where are you are you putting in line their issues of family development and individual development?
Yeah, and just to say that even where you might have emerging incidences that may not have been foreseen, then how do you stand with these people so that then they also feel the organization really recognizes what we do? We've seen back at home also incidents where we have the cover for disaster, you know, the accidents that happen in the course of response. But what about possibility of ailments that may have been caused by virtue of the work that they did as Red Cross volunteers? So how do we make sure that we can be able to cover them for that? Then finally, is just as a means of motivating those volunteers in building that cohesion and them identifying, is to have a constant way of recognizing the volunteers. Make awards. And back at home also what we've been lucky to try is we have award ceremony for volunteers at national level, region, and even some of the branches are now doing it. So that each year, somebody is looking forward towards being nominated for being being the best volunteer in the specific areas, and that you can see that one, it's going to contribute indirectly to the bit of resilience, because if I want to remain so that at the end of the year or at the end of 3 years, when the award ceremony is being done, I can be recognized, then you see we're going to build that resilience indirectly. And so there are a number of, we cannot just pick on an item directly and say this will build volunteer resilience. We have a number of things to do.
It's really interesting because it's a multifaceted approach to building resilience, isn't it? Like at the incentivization, building capacity, and so much at an organizational level as well. And I guess my follow-up question to you, Janet, is from your research into resilience, how do you think VSO is looking forward to or is currently doing resilience as an organization for its volunteers?
Okay, so we haven't done much research on resilience because I think we're starting out. And the kind of backstory is we, in Sierra Leone, we've got a history of volunteers going home when problems get difficult. So when issues arise in countries, emergency situations, we have moved volunteers out of the country. But in Sierra Leone, we had youth volunteers working, counterparts from the UK working with local Sierra Leonean young people, youth volunteers. We had to take our youth volunteers out of Sierra Leone when Ebola started, but the youth volunteers that were left, that were national, did a lot of work raising awareness in communities because of what they'd learned through the start of their youth volunteering program. And at a similar time in Nepal, when the earthquake happened, we again moved volunteers away or offered to, but a lot of our international volunteers wanted to remain. And that has made us start thinking about, actually, we can contribute. We do need to think about how we can work in emergency and crisis settings. But it's very early days for us. So I don't think that really answers your question because we haven't done that research yet.
Yeah, sure.
I'm looking forward to the point at which we will start doing that research. But yeah, it's something that I think we haven't got lots and lots of evidence about yet. That doesn't really answer your question though, does it?
That's a starting point.
Yeah.
I guess the key question is resilience. You know, we've talked about it in terms that could be general at an individual or community level, but how specifically can we talk about it for local actors in conflict settings? You know, talking about very urgent, pressing needs, and often there's, you know, the contrast is placed between a long-term capacity building and an immediate response, and how do you not do one or the other? You know, how do you not do one which alienates the other? What do people think about that?
with the ICRC, we've worked quite a lot over the past decade plus with national societies, listening to the volunteers, these mini listening studies, you could say, to and with the staff as well, to see how we can have some concrete steps and measures and actions that can be taken by staff and volunteers, some quick wins, and prioritizing what they are to increase the security, safety, and access to staff and volunteers to the communities and all the local actors that they're working with. And we've developed a framework called the Safer Access Framework that looks at 8 elements. We have a brochure here as well that goes through it, and a short video that I wanted to show, maybe just after this, we can look at it. But it's really a framework that I think is very complementary to building this resilience, to doing everything that an organization can to look at where they can find these quick wins, and also longer-term practices that look at things like the insurance for volunteers, that look at the internal communication, the decision-making processes, the personal protective equipment, all of those aspects that give that that safeguard, so to speak, or that we do everything that we can to ensure that safety and to increase that safety and do what we can to protect volunteers and staff as much as possible.
One of the pieces I was reading in preparation for this was about the post-election crises in Kenya, and there's quite a bit about it on the IFRC website actually, particularly in Rift Valley, you know. And Michael, do you want to share something about how resilience would work in that context? How do you even focus on resilience when something like that's happening?
I think what we discovered, you know, even during that that phase of post-election violence was the need for you know a higher number of volunteers that we needed urgently, yet maybe the numbers that we had were not sufficient. And then so there was a rapid development of a minimum package of information and skill that you would need. So you would take volunteers, take them through certain minimum lessons, and then what you do is a very detailed way of making a follow-up. You follow them through, and even after the engagement, you make sure that you are able to retain them, because then the costs that you've taken a lot of resources and engaging them and doing the basic training, you don't want to lose the efforts that you've put in place. But we also had to elevate quite a number of others to be team leaders, and before you've really tested their leadership capabilities over time, and that also made, of course, demand in terms of the guidelines on what they can be able to do. And I think that those are some of the things that pushed the National Society to develop national volunteer management guidelines that any manager can just pick it, and you have a lot of templates that help you in the recruitment, in the management from day to day. And we even set up the expectations, like the qualities of a volunteer, and then so now sustaining that standard is yet another thing that has over time now had to be built. But for sure, you cannot have quick fixes. Every other time, I would say, as a national society or the movement, is that we know that we will always require to deploy volunteers. We will I think the message I would put across is we need to be setting always a minimum number. If you think that you've lost volunteers because of various reasons and you fall below a certain number, then you just have to actively move back and recruit. Otherwise, you will just get to a situation where you can't move. The other bit is we've had a lot of discussions with the volunteers on talking to them that they cannot their capability to resist taking sides. And taking side do not necessarily mean they go and picket with the political parties, but they may not be able to, for the purpose of being a volunteer, they may not express that opinion on whom they would want to support. We talked to them, and we've all agreed in principle. Issues of politics, we may not be able to take part. You can only see. So it's, you can only see what's happening, but you cannot discuss it, because then you never know when you make this kind of remarks, who will listen to you and how will they be able to take it. So that was one lesson that we learned. And the other was, you recall yesterday we talked about defining what local was, and we said we don't want to define beyond a certain level, which was a branch. But importantly is you need to always understand the geographical locations and perceived support by various parties. So if somebody comes from an area that they can perceive, he is a supporter of that, a different group, then even though you are not a target, but you don't want to provoke a situation where somebody will be tempted to start questioning that. So those are some of the things that the organization was keen in doing, just to make sure that you send the right type of volunteers to a specific place. And in some cases, we had to really incur quite a significant amount of costs in moving management staff from one area to another where they would easily be able to work. So the aspect of showing that you're neutral, that you're not taking any side, is an aspect that you cannot ignore. And
enforce, yeah.
You just have to make a conscious action, because it's all about perception. The moment they perceive you to be supporting one group, you're done, and that can compromise a lot of things. Yeah.
Well, that's the first part of the roundtable that's done. Thank you so much to the guests on the roundtable. We're going to open up to the floor for questions, comments, suggestions. You can address the members individually or as a group and ask an open question. So we've got some time for that. We've got 15 minutes or so. So, yeah, fire away, please. We'll start with Matt and then work our way around, then you and you.
Sorry.
It's on.
Sorry, I'll say that again. So thank you to all the panel. And I was saying that it's really nice to have that kind of level of honesty from Janet and from VSO, in that sense of saying, well, this is a concept and it's bandied around and we really don't know. So that was really firstly a thank you, and thank you all of you. And I really like the kind of richness and the kind of detail that's coming out. I think one of the things that struck me most was Lily's point about institutions. I thought that was really, really important. I suppose one of my questions was how the panel think we can deal, and a number of you in different ways have said, it's working across lots of different actors, and there are institutional frameworks that are really, really important, but there are also multiple frameworks at play all at once, and there are lots of different institutions that come together to frame and kind of enable resilience across different actors. So I suppose that was one of my questions. Well, that's brilliant, but historically within the kind of development humanitarian sphere, that's been a problem, because we've never managed to kind of break out of many of those silos. So I just wondered if there was kind of any reflections on how do we try and do that a little bit differently?
Who wants
Are
to
we
start?
going to do one question at a time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
or you know, people can comment. It's free for all.
I mean, I think it's a good question. I think for me, I mean, there are two issues that would be interesting to hear about how it's handled in the movement. But, you know, if you look at disasters, not specifically conflict, you know, 90% of lives saved in emergencies is done by local actors. But when you look at resources and how they're configured across institutions, frameworks within the aid system, obviously we know, you know, there's quite a different story and a lot of work to do to make sure the resources are there, you know, to support some of the types of things that Michael, for example, talked about. And then the other thing is we do have all these different global frameworks. And again, from our research, we found that volunteerism for resilience was very focused on this kind of very small cycle of, you know, absorbing shocks, responding to shocks, and not at all enough for prevention and adaptation and transformation. And I think, you know, this does tell us that we need a new way of working. We need a strategic approach to thinking about volunteers far beyond a means of implementation, which is actually how they're pitched in Agenda 2030, for example, which is now our overarching framework for peace and development, to a more strategic approach. And I think a lot of it is getting out, you know, saying that this is actually a fundamental, a foundation of across the peace, security, development nexus. We've got volunteers here in communities, and we need to move away from this very projectized approach, which means that we don't, you know, meet the full needs, because that has implications for how we work, when we work with people, the types of support we're able to give people as volunteers. So I think we do have diverse, you know, frameworks that we sometimes, you know, try and shoehorn a little bit as a sector volunteerism into as this kind of means of implementation. And I think actually resilience also doesn't fit very well into most of those frameworks, and volunteerism doesn't fit very well. And I think that makes it even more challenging. But I think in a way there's some opportunity to bring them together and to think about how we move beyond projects to a much more strategic investment in volunteerism. Yeah.
That's great. Would you like to?
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just to add to what we've done more recently in the past few years is really tried to engage all levels of the national society. So to bring in volunteers, to bring in the branch, to bring in the headquarters, to bring in the governance even of the national society, to have them in this mini listening exercise. We didn't call it a listening exercise, we called it a planning and assessment workshop. But it started with hearing what are the stories from the field. What are the experiences that volunteers and branch staff have gone through who are on the front line, and what are some of those commonalities, and how can we and how can they hear each other about it? Because they don't, it's bringing people together and hearing that, and then saying, okay, well, there's a framework that we can have that is more strategic, that isn't looking at individual projects, that is really looking at national society development from an operational perspective of trying to meet those needs. And where are those priorities, and what does each national society have to do to support the volunteers, or, you know, and what training is needed for the volunteers, what is the responsibility of the individual, but also at every level of the organization in terms of what is allowed to be communicated and how does communication put you at risk, all in this world of false, fake news, and how do you decipher what is the information to pass, how do you do this contact risk assessment, how do you maintain on top of the situation all of the time because it's constantly evolving, and to give that framework and to follow up with national societies on this and hear back from them. And so I think that's really important, is hearing what is out there and then seeing step by step in a longer term plan, but also shorter term, prioritizing those steps and actions because they are there and they can be taken. And we don't want to leave it up to volunteers to have to be innovative. In some ways, they need to be innovative, but in a conflict situation, they really need to know what are the guidelines, what are the actions. It has to be ingrained in them because it's too risky. And it can't be up to the individual to decide, oh, should I do this, should I not? I mean, there are certain decisions you make, but there should be red lines that are in place that are drawn by the organization as this is the threshold of risk. And beyond this, you don't go. Or also asking the volunteer, do you feel comfortable moving forward in this? If you don't, it's okay. You know, because in the end, safety is most important.
Great. Yeah, sure.
For us, it's a bit of a different context. So we do place volunteers in those institutions. So what we're able to do is to work with community volunteers on the ground to inform how we can change policy at a government level, both local government and central government level. And the strength comes when the two tie up and you have teams of volunteers working at different levels together.
Through partnerships.
Yeah.
Great. And there was a question there. Yeah. Would you like to say your name through the mic and your question, please?
My name is Laura from the Swedish Red Cross. I found it really interesting what Michael was saying about the retention part in the Kenyan Red Cross, how you want to create this generational movement of people and the retention of families almost within the Red Cross. Because I found in some national societies where I worked that one of the biggest problem is actually the governance, what you touched, that they are not very interested in actually having a group that is very active, feels the Red Cross identity as one of the priorities, and is proud and has a space within the organization as a volunteer group. So my question is, in your case, in the Kenyan Red Cross, on what level did you take the initiative of starting really to give this opportunity to the volunteers, and how did you engage the governance?
Well, we were lucky that it started with a project. We had a project that was looking at fire safety in the informal settlements that are continuously affected. And every day we would look at the resources that we were spending as a national society responding to these fires. Every day you go and issue non-food items for 200 households, 100 households, 300 households, and that was the cycle. When we did the proposal, I think we were actually supported by the Danish Red Cross to run that project. We formulated a training curriculum for the informal settlements, and we looked at the target groups who were in that. Every time you have a fire, the person who is most affected will be children, because they will not be able to go to school for the next almost 1 week. And when they go back to when they go to school, most likely they are disconnected now because they don't have the notes that they have always written. So that particular term is affected. And so in the end, this child would not perform. So the other was the parents and the leadership of the place, because the slums don't have roots. So when we formed this the curriculum and we trained the children on fire safety, the adults, then we wanted them to be taking part in reporting the fire and fighting the fire. So initially, whenever there is a fire, then they would call the fire brigade. But before we went there, they were saying the fire brigade are late. In fact, they used to stone the fire brigade. But we went there, I had to tell them, the fire brigade learn about the fire when you call them. So you need to have the numbers, and don't depend even on the toll-free line. We exchanged with them the numbers of the chief fire officer, the local administration leader, and the local police, so that they were able to talk to the leadership directly. We have a fire in this particular place. So once this started to take shape, was that we realized that there was need to have that group working together, and we needed to have a small structure. And so that is how we started to build that, the group that we registered there and trained them as volunteers, and we recruited them as volunteers. And we formed now the youth sector, which was the response team. They are able to run with buckets of water and sand and whatever. And then we had a governance structure more of from the village still, where we actually called it the community disaster response unit. So the unit is more of the management, but the response team is the response arm. And then, so once they were registered, and we linked them now to the branch. So whenever we have activities at the branch, they would come as part of volunteers for the branch. And we also seconded now volunteers who have been at the branch level doing coordination for youth and such like. We attached some of the youths to specific to specific slum zones, so that whenever they also have fire, then they call this team leader. This volunteer becomes like their mentor. And slowly we formed those community units, which later now are actually part of Red Cross. And a number of them have formed now the community, they've formed the IGA groups, the CBOs, they've registered them, and they are doing small businesses. Normally, maybe they are not making a lot of profit as would be anticipated, but from our side, we are glad that they have something in common. Once you have registered as a CBO, you've something that is putting you together. Of course, I wouldn't say that it has happened in all the slums or all the branches, but we've done it like now within Nairobi to about 14 slums. Yeah, so, and it's expanding, and it's becoming a model that even branches from other areas are now coming to learn. For the rural areas, the same case, where every time, like areas where they have drought, when you're going to do distribution of distribution of food, or you are doing a medical outreach, there is always one person you call, so that he organizes the other team. Again, we've managed to talk to them, register them within those clusters, and they form a team. So in the rural areas, not really as developed as Nairobi, but they are coming up to have that relationship. And when they have challenges, including, so when you have, say, a child has drowned in a dam, they would call that team leader, who would call the Red Cross authority within the area. So we're seeing, groups forming up and are actually in the name of this is a Red Cross unit. This is a Red Cross unit. We struggle, work with them to make sure that they are now fully affiliated with us as registered volunteers, registered members. And when we have an activity on the ground, we engage them. So that is how we've been able to build those community teams and units.
That's great. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Yes. In fact, my question will be to Lily. In fact, from your experience, I know I'm Khalda from Palestine Red Crescent Society first. We used to work on resilience since now this 5th year, and our latest strategy was about how to build the capacity of community and resilience. And from our experience, we learned that in order to really build the capacities of communities towards resilience, you need an efficient, resilient volunteers network. And we have probably about 10,000 volunteers, active volunteers, in addition to the branches and all linked to branches. In our situation, usually, as Lily knows, that we are always, our network work during in conflicts and in weather change, or even during developmental issues like awareness, or all are well trained to do this kind of job. From your experience, Lily, as ICRC has role and to contribute in this resilience volunteers, what kind of systems could be developed in the future, or if you have already did this, to protect the volunteers network when they are alone in any conflict, during conflicts, whereas there is no control or manager for the national societies. There will be a support for the volunteers themselves and for, but really as a leader, society or partner in a conflict area, what kind of systems do you have or developed regarding to improve this support for the volunteers? Thank you. I know it's difficult, but it's good to think about it.
No, it's a very good question, and yeah, having worked in Gaza long together with the Palestinian Red Crescent and the volunteers, the amazing staff and volunteers who are working in incredible conditions there. I think it's going back to this thing about making sure that the volunteers don't feel like they're alone out there, that there is this backup support system that they can go to in terms of having this structure within the national society and together with ICRC supporting wherever possible to have systems and structures in place that they can come back from an operation or an assistance and be able to share their experience, to take those lessons learned, to record them, to integrate them back into the national society, to see what worked and make that stronger, what didn't work, where was the gap, how do we build on those systems? Is it internal communication? Is it equipment there? Is it external communication with the stakeholders and how we can address all of those situations? There's no quick fix, and I think it's just from more dialogue, more experience, more putting together tools, more awareness, all of those things that we have to do together. And it's context specific, different within a national society, whether you're in the West Bank or whether you're in Gaza, it's still the Palestinian Red Crescent, but the situations might be a little bit different, and what those volunteers need initially as well, because if they feel like they have their basic needs met as well, and have the security of the organization behind them, then they will become more resilient. I don't know. I can, like I said, we can take a look at this video. We can take a look because there's also a practical toolbox that looks at volunteer behavior and identification and actions that also national societies have also contributed tools to this that may also be of use. So that's what I can say in a nutshell. Sorry.
Thank you. We're all very, very concerned about the security and the safety of volunteers in the field. This year has been particularly difficult for the movement. We've lost 36 staff members that we know of in the field, 31 of which died through violence. Only 5 have died in road traffic accidents this year. It's usually the inverse. So we really do need, as a movement, to look, how can we help this? And for me, coming back into the movement this year from having spent 7 years out, it's been interesting to see how we are stovepiped. We are working on the same problem from different viewpoints when we should really be trying to work all together. We all have lots of training packages. The IFRC have training packages. The ICRC has training packages. Lots of national societies. But what I feel we really need to do is to instill a culture of security within the movement, to ensure that senior management understands the importance of the safety and security of staff in the field and what the repercussions are. And for me, there's 2 approaches that we need to be looking at. A grassroots approach from the volunteers, reminding them, yes, you're there to do a job, you're there to do good, but you also need to help yourselves. And make them demand also from their organizations that they assume the responsibility to get them the training, the equipment, the plans, the processes in place, that they will be safe. And I think that to do that, we all have limited resources, but if we pull them together, if we start working together better as a movement, we can make much better use of the resources that we have. That's possibly a personal opinion and not the Federation's opinion.
Yes, my name is Eva Augustin. I'm working in the Swedish Red Cross with technical support to volunteering development in our partner national societies. And I would like to say, I would like to come back, you know, to the concept on resilience development and how it's challenging our traditional view on volunteering development. In the Federation, we have a quite clear approach on our role in resilience development. We are not Red Cross, Red Crescent, we are not leading resilience development for the community. We are assisting, we are contributing as a partner, but still we have our auxiliary role in emergencies, and that challenges us very much because we can think in this, what I call a more traditional way of our tools and quality assurance of response in the auxiliary role. But then you have mentioned we have the other role in the branch and volunteers. They should contribute to resilience development, transfer knowledge, connect to resources and all this. And we can just do that if we are an attractive partner, trustful partner. What I can see in those national societies that I'm supporting, this is becoming quite a challenge in organization of volunteering. I can agree the concept of volunteering doesn't really fit in, but we have to find forms for this and develop that. Because this joining the community, we have to have conflict sensitivity in this as well, because our volunteers, there are research reports confirming that volunteers, might not be identified as professional that we want them to be. They are mainly identified as community members. And more or less going into the professional work. So they are very much community members. And when the conflicts strike in the community, your neighbor are not a Red Cross volunteer, you might be it. They see they are different, you know, in this situation. The relation to the community, the security responsibility, there are a lot of these kind of issues that has been mentioned in the listening studies that really, you know, comes up and become a challenge. And we can, handling this in the wrong way, you know, there might be conflicts. Why is he insured? I'm not insured. And when the community go together, you know, it's not really clear always who is the Red Crosser, who is it not. So for the volunteers, also from their perspective, this is a challenge, you know, when am I a community member and when am I a Red Crosser? And also for the leadership, linked to insurance question, because you are insured when you go clearly on a Red Cross operation. So I would like, do you have any comments? You understand me? Do you have any comments on this? Kenya, in your resilience development, I hear that you have a lot of branch focus, and that's the common way for us to think in this way always. But we have to challenge us in this and see how can we become a strong partner in community resilience. Yeah, I leave it now because otherwise
It's quite a tricky position to be in, and that's why I think, as you say, it requires a lot of discussion for it. And you know, everyone runs today and talk of want to build community resilience, and from, of course, many perspectives of you know, the development. I think for me is just a change of the approaches in terms of developmental programming. from what we've traditionally been known for. Even as a national society back at home, if you ask many people, maybe 70% of them think that the Red Cross are those people who come in when there is trouble. You know, they don't see us as people who, you know, are proactive and work on programs that enable communities to withstand the various shocks, which is more or actually the resilience approach. But what I would simply say is that maybe that is not pronounced, and we just need to think about our programming, all of it, taking it from the angle of building community resilience, and by extension, of course, will feed to our volunteer resilience. And we need now to probably talk about it. Much of what the Red Cross is known, I don't know many other places, but in my country specifically, people look at us as people who come in when there is trouble, and we've always had the some task to explain that we are there running, say, for example, the fire safety program. It was long term and is looking at the resilience and mitigation of incidences. When you look at water and sanitation and drought, again, we're looking at it from building the community resilience, ensuring that they are able to produce their own food, they are able to access water and be able to use that water to generate resources that can help them. So I think it's more of bringing out now this perspective and talking about it, so that if it is possible, then maybe this is how people should also know us, that we look far ahead rather than just waiting and respond during emergencies.
Jump in, if you don't mind. I think it's a very valid point that Michael's bringing up, is that and this is the benefit when we partner also with the Red Cross or Red Crescent Society in the countries where we're working with, because we respond at the emergency time. But if that's the only time you're responding, where have you developed this whole relationship with the community that allows you even the access and the acceptance to be able to respond? And so there's so much work that isn't maybe profiled the same way or doesn't draw the same attention in the media about the work that the local Red Cross and Red Crescent does, and those volunteers throughout every day in all of the development work that builds those relationships, that provides the relevant services that communities need. And then when something happens, that's where you've already developed that relationship, that access, that acceptance, and then the community also serves as a bit of a security network for you, and can, so.
Yeah. Great. Go one more question.
I'm Lucy from the... Is this on?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm Lucy from the British Red Cross. I think it's so interesting to hear the discussion, and I think that focus on resilience is absolutely right. I guess my question is, given that this particular initiative is looking at conflict and emergencies, is it possible ever to draw a distinction between what is just good volunteering practice and what is specific to volunteering in conflict and emergencies?
Maggie, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think it's challenging in our work. I have to say, when it starts, even just building on that last conversation, when it starts coming to solutions and what we should be doing differently, I think we find so much that's just like, well, this has been kicking around for 10 years or 20 years. And I think in the context of resilience, not necessarily only to conflict, we know things come and go in our sector, and I think, challenging to sometimes think, are we actually adding anything new, or is this just another push for some of the principles of whether it's good development or good humanitarian work or effective engagement with volunteers? I think maybe what what's new, or maybe what we're starting to appreciate a little bit more with resilience, is a couple of things. One is, just the scale and the frequency and the way that shocks and stresses are happening is changing. So, for example, when we look at conflict, if you look at the world, we used to have this division between stable and unstable countries, for example. And now we're understanding a lot more that, for example, domestic inequalities and rifts can very quickly move into different levels of conflict. Or what's also challenging when we're trying to think about a strategic approach is, the nation state. We talk about different countries, and you're organised, as national societies. But if you look at conflict, for example, there's these kind of lines of hotspots, which are not necessarily national level. They often are sub-national. And a lot of those don't actually get as much maybe recognition in the media and so on. So I think this is what's changing, and this is what we're trying to appreciate. And resilience is a very dynamic concept. It's not about getting back to where things were before. It's actually transforming. And I think we've actually struggled in our research to really find resilient communities. We wanted to look at volunteerism in resilient communities, and I guess our conclusion was actually that they weren't very resilient because of some of the challenges that we've talked about here today. So I think in the context of conflict, and I think in the context of research, and understanding the landscape and the way that it's moving and the way that it's changing and how resilience and volunteerism are affecting each other, I think the conversations that we've had over the last couple of days are really important, because I think you can have your theory, you can have your national systems and national ownership, but the way that things are happening, where decisions are taken, where capacities need to be able to respond effectively, it's much more complicated than I think a lot of the tools that we already have, and the way that we engage with volunteerism. So I don't think it's completely new. But I think our understanding and maybe the nuances are better, and I think that's what's really impressive about what's coming out of the VICE research so far. But I would say, the cynical view is also there is a lot that we already knew that we should be doing, and we haven't done that, and maybe it gives a sense of urgency as well to some of those outstanding projects about transferring capacities, supporting local capacities, not undermining as organisations, as international organisations, not undermining those foundations of community resilience that are already there as we come and go as actors. Of course, we've known about this for a long time, but I think the onus is really on us to understand how to do that. And then I think the types of partnerships that we think about in our solutions are also really slightly changing. I mean, again, not so much conflict, but the way that different shocks and stresses, so conflict interacting with climate change, for example. One of your colleagues from Fiji was at the COP23 in Bonn last month, and he was talking about, we've always focused on volunteerism and local knowledge, but local knowledge only takes us so far these days, because actually, the Sendai framework talks about future risks. We don't know about future risks. We don't know how conflict and climate change are interacting, and they're not able to draw on the community resources that they were always able to. They need support from elsewhere in new ways and new configurations, and that was a very good message actually from that national society. So I don't know, I think it's very difficult.
Thank you. Final remark.
I mean, coming from an organization that works primarily in conflict settings, I would say that there is a difference. There's good practice that needs to be continued throughout, but there is a difference in volunteering in conflicts and an obligation of the organization to provide, like Julian was saying, this security culture that ICRC has embedded in the work that it does, and with the National Society staff and volunteers especially, to have that in the in the forefront of their mind with everything that they do. It's so much more heightened, and it is different working in conflicts than in disasters or other situations because of all the unknowns, the suspicions of who you are, the lenses and perceptions that people see the work that you're doing is critical, and the awareness of that is essential, and that you're not just guarded by the emblem that you're wearing. It comes with so much more than that, and how critical that is. So I just would like to stress that.
Yeah. Well, that's the end of the roundtable, and hopefully, did you want to add something?
No, it's just I'm Anders from the Swedish Red Cross. I was just thinking. You mentioned not building back to where it was before. I think that's really important because when it comes to building like buildings, if you have an earthquake, you can build back better. But how do you do that with volunteers? How do we ensure that they are better equipped after being involved in some kind of actions within an emergency or a conflict? How do we ensure that they are actually recovering better so they are a bit higher up when they leave the emergency or conflict? I think that's a critical issue actually, and that is something that we need to take care of as organizations. That's our responsibility.
Yeah. And in a way that, you know, we leave this panel with more questions than answers, which is probably the best thing we could have done. So I'm conscious of time, so I know we could keep going on discussing many more topics around the resilience theme, but please feel free to grab the panel members or each other and do talk about this more over coffee. I'd also encourage you to look through the data set. Maybe you'll find what local volunteers have to say about their everyday situations, and you probably won't find the word resilient there. I tried looking through it. You won't find it. Probably one instance where it's mentioned, but everything is, you know, interconnected. So see if that kind of helps you or throws even more questions, even better. So I'm going to pass over to Stefan. But before I do, a huge round of applause for our panelists, please.
Thank you very much for an interesting discussion. And as you said, there are many more questions arising rather than answers provided. That's interesting. I have the one answer that right now. There's a coffee break. And it's going to be a long coffee break, 30 minutes, because I noticed that most of you talk quite a lot during coffee breaks, and we always interrupt in the end of the coffee break. So maybe we can just have a good conversation. And as you said, you have the panelists here that you can definitely approach and continue the discussion. So thank you very much. Back at 11 o'clock.
Is this working? Is this working? Hi, good morning to you all. Can I ask you all to take a seat so that we can just start the session? But before we go to the second roundtable on leadership, we are going to watch a quick 3-minute video on safer access by ICRC, which Lily was actually referring to earlier. So we'll start that first, and then we'll go to the roundtable on leadership.
Safer access in brief. The humanitarian landscape has dramatically changed over the years. While staff and volunteers of the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies work closely with communities and oftentimes come from the communities, access to those in need is not guaranteed. This is largely because access and acceptance is influenced by how stakeholders perceive our work. If individuals or groups of people, including beneficiaries, do not understand who we are, what we do, how and why we do things, suspicion arises, which can affect our access and acceptance. Such suspicion could easily lead to suspension or blockage, or even to severe security incidents when not addressed. How we work and apply the fundamental principles in our actions and activities contributes to safer access. It is therefore important that we use the Safer Access Framework to strengthen and maintain our ability to provide service to people and communities in need. The Safer Access Framework, when applied in our programs, activities and decision-making process, supports in maintaining and/or strengthening the safer access of the National Red Cross and Red Crescent Society's staff and volunteers. It strengthens national society's ability to provide effective humanitarian services to all people and communities who are in need of their services, particularly in situations involving violence or risk of violence. The areas of access, perception, acceptance and security are the areas that underpin the Safer Access Framework. To strengthen each area, the framework recommends concrete actions and measures which are grouped into 8 elements. To maintain a positive perception and gain acceptance, national societies have to work on their identification, external communication and coordination, acceptance of the individual, and acceptance of the organization. To increase safety and security of the staff and volunteers, the National Society has to invest in carrying out context and risk assessment, developing their operational security risk management, and strengthening the internal communication and coordination. A strong legal and policy base that clearly defines the humanitarian mandate of the National Society to respond to natural disasters and sensitive and insecure contexts such as armed conflict, internal disturbances and tensions will aid the NS staff and volunteers in gaining access. Ensuring that all stakeholders of influence towards the National Society's access, acceptance and security fully understand and accept our humanitarian mandate and our way of working is a continuous process. When we consistently work on the elements of the Safer Access Framework and clearly demonstrate in our actions and programs our adherence to the 7 fundamental principles, we maintain and strengthen our access to people and communities in need. We work on our safer access because we want to reach and serve people and communities in need.
Okay, so this is the second roundtable on leadership. And as Matt and Stefan were saying earlier, when we started plowing through the data, we started to look for issues that specifically relate to leadership. And there were a lot of references to leadership, but leadership was mostly spoken about in terms of the strategies, in terms of policies, in terms of IFRC, ICRC, national societies, branch leadership, and that kind of stuff. It was not very much referred to in terms of leadership at the grassroots or community level. However, that does not mean that leadership was not present at the grassroots or volunteer level, because they were talking about the responses that they had to take on an impromptu basis, the partnerships they were building with other stakeholders at a local level, the funds that they raise in innovative ways. So there were a lot of leadership skills that they were exhibiting, volunteers were exhibiting at a grassroots level, but they were not referred to as leadership or leadership skills. So this is a session where we kind of explore that, and in a way, I have an easy job compared to Delvin, because we all have a very generic understanding of what leadership is. However, do we? That is the question. What do we mean by leadership? What are the elements of leadership? And I know this is a room full of leaders in different capacities, so I am not going to be, short of opinions and ideas about leadership. But before that, let us introduce the panel first, and then we have two researchers. I mean, I don't want to make that division between researchers and practitioners, but there are two people who have done research on leadership, and there are two people whose experiences kind of speak volumes about their leadership experiences, as well as what they have observed in terms of leadership at the volunteer level. So let us hear from them. Could you please introduce yourself first, and then perhaps let's start with a very generic question. What do you mean by leadership, and what are some of the key elements of leadership? First that, and then we'll go into your specific research. So Christoph, could you please start?
Yeah, my name is Christoph. I'm working in the German Red Cross in charge of volunteer leadership development. I'm also currently the chairman of the European Network of Volunteering. And I'm teaching at the Civil Defense Academy Leadership.
Helena?
All right, my name is Helena Hermansson. I work at the Swedish Defense University. I did my PhD at the Center for Natural Disaster Science in Uppsala. And during my PhD, I went to Turkey, and I studied collaboration mainly. So I'm a collaboration researcher, actually. And I studied collaboration between all different actors in society that took care of or managed the earthquakes happening in Van and Arjish on the border to Iran in 2011. So of course, the volunteers were not my main focal area, but of course I came in contact with NGOs and volunteers in the cooperation with other actors too. So that's how I come in mainly. So I guess maybe I'm the only one in here today that's not actually working for the Red Cross. So I'm a bit of an outsider that way. But I have to say I've been a member of the Red Cross since 1990. So please accept me. And I have also dressed in red for the occasion, trying to blend in. And I've actually been an active volunteer in Sweden, doing many different activities as a volunteer for the Red Cross.
Thank you, Helena.
Okay.
Khalida.
Khalida, you already know me. In fact, in my National Society, Palestine Red Crescent, I'm in charge, I'm the director of Planning and Development Department. I've been, now it's 17 years, working in different departments or programs. So I was past the whole departments, management, administration, organizational development. I have for a long time in contact with the branches. I was responsible for developing different guidelines and different related to the governance. So that's why it gave me a lot of capabilities to understand how things going on and how volunteers, governance, and even management work together. And from that point, I was trying to really to support the concept of leadership of volunteers in different contexts. Thank you.
Well, my name is Bessie Valle. I am the National Volunteering Director for Honduran Red Cross. I work, just to give you a little bit of my story, I came to the Red Cross as a first aid volunteer in 2012, rapidly evolving into a volunteer leader for organic reasons. And then I started working for the National Society in my current position at the end of 2014, start of 2015. I think in my experience, I must say, I believe leadership comes in a very organic way. And up to the moment, we must recognize, and I think, I feel very inexperienced compared to the other people on the panel, but I think in the movement, we need to start thinking about leadership as such, and try to drift away from everything being so organic and so unspoken sometimes. I'm very happy to be part of this panel here with Nisha and my colleagues, because I think it's important that we talk about it and just put it on the table and see what we can actually do about these very important topics. So thank you very much for having me here.
You're welcome. I think we should start with that first question. I mean, as I said before, we all have some understanding of what leadership is. There are some tangible elements of leadership, like someone who is managing a team or taking decisions or being accountable. And there are also some invisible elements and that we do not really talk about, and then we do not normally associate with leadership. So how do you conceptualize leadership, and can you challenge sort of our generic understanding of leadership slightly forward and include a much more broader perspective to this concept of leadership? Christoph, if you could start, please, and then the rest of the panel.
Yeah. Well, I understand leadership as an approach to support and facilitate volunteers to fulfill defined humanitarian tasks in interaction with the beneficiaries, the community, and the organization.
Oh, okay. I was expecting a little bit more longer answer. Sorry. So can I probe you on that? So you said it is an approach to facilitate volunteers to fulfill their tasks. What about leadership at the volunteer level? When you say facilitating volunteers, that means that is an external party that is facilitating volunteers. Can we talk about leadership at that level?
Sure,
and what does that mean then?
Yes, I believe
and
that.
Please take more time to answer.
Okay. No, I'm very sure that many volunteers have the capacity to lead themselves and interact with the target groups and also, let's say, with the representatives of the organization to express also clearly their needs and their capacities, but also their rights. While the organization might come up with some duties, but very important is that volunteers are aware why they volunteer, what they want to get out of it, what are the conditions, and what they can contribute to the organization. And I think this has a lot to do with learning, whether volunteers and the organization is willing to learn. Then, of course, they can choose a leader, but in traditional settings like Red Cross societies, leaders require also a certain training, and they have a mandate to take also certain decisions. But it depends very much also on their leadership style and their capacities, how they involve beneficiaries and volunteers. And they are very, I would say, there's a broad variety of organizational cultures existing in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And they are not all, definitely not all, very democratic.
Interesting. So you referred to capacity there and rights and responsibilities and duties and everything. Bessie, if I could come to you, you were a volunteer before you became the volunteer development manager. So what sort of leadership did you observe or did you sort of practice at that level, which is not recognized at the leadership, as in like formal leadership level within the foundation?
Well, I think, as you said, there are many both tangible and invisible elements that we usually recognize as leadership. In the tangible, I think we might be very clear in this room what these elements might be, like having appropriate communication skills and being able to make decisions and improvisation in some cases, you name it. Then there are these invisible things that we might not be able to reach a consensus in this moment about. And these are elements that both skills and knowledge that make us able to be leaders of others. But I think what we rarely talk about is the other dimension to leadership, that is the ability, as Christoph talked about, to lead yourself. And I think that we might have been led away from at some point. And we, the same way that when we talk about resilience, we generally talk about resilience towards the outside. We rarely focus in our own leadership in the inside. And how I apply those principles of leadership towards myself. I think that's rarely spoken of. And I think that is where we generally have to find the talent both in ourselves and in others. I strongly believe there's an element of both resilience, and I think we spoke very widely about that in the morning, how to be a good leader, you have to be a very resilient individual. And also to, in my opinion, be in a state of mind in which you're working for your own self-development. I strongly believe there cannot be a leader that is not striving towards a better self. And then there's another element that can apply maybe to both dimensions, both being a leader for myself and being a leader for others. That is the concept of do no harm. So how my actions are somehow not hurting me and not creating those negative effects, both in a short and in a long term. And I think that's also connected to resilience. But I think all those things are very difficult elements to pinpoint. I think this is a very large topic that we could do tons and tons of research about. But all of these things somehow connect to each other. It's just about finding that connection.
Yeah,
I suppose.
Yes. Thank you, Bessie. I mean, when I was listening to the resilience session in the morning, I thought there were so many parallels between the two. Khalida, if I could come to you, what is resilience in the absence of a formal sort of, leadership system, particularly in places like Gaza and Spang and all? If there are places where you have to be a leader and take decision, not just in the middle of crisis or anything, but also on an everyday basis. And we looked at one paper yesterday about how they do negotiations on a daily basis, how they negotiate access on a daily basis. And I think there is an issue in terms of how much flexibility they have in terms of taking these decisions, but at the same time, making sure that they are not being exposed to risk. So that, I guess, is a paradox there, whereas we provide space for them to take decisions and take resolutions and responses on their own, as in facilitating leadership skills, but at the same time making sure that they are operating within that framework where they are risk-free, so to speak. So how do you kind of, negotiate those two things in a practice setting?
Yeah, from practice, Palestine Red Crescent Society started to think about resilience, as I said, 4 years ago, and really we built our strategy 2014 to 18. It's to prepare ourselves for such situations going now. And from that time, we started to think more, to do more analysis regarding the changes that could be happen outside, inside, external, regarding the challenge of environment change, weather change, and also to the conflicts, the political situation. All of this situation took into consideration, and we tried to work on that. And since that time, really, we thought about that what you are talking about now, it's in such situation while everything, there is a negotiation, there is clashes, there is conflict, taking into consideration that Palestine Red Crescent headquarters, it's in Ramallah under occupation, while we are also supporting Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria and the whole, this continuous conflict, fleeing of Palestinians from Syria to Lebanon, and the burden of Lebanese, the facilities of Palestine Red Crescent Society supporting and providing the needed support and care. To be honest with you, we had no choice, only to really build and shape our leadership everywhere in Lebanon, Syria, and also the backbone of PRCS is the volunteers. As I mentioned this morning, we had the structure that we had to build and develop. First of all, to have 43 branches and sub-branches in Gaza, West Bank, and Syria, Lebanon. And we have also the active volunteers, the network that we built, developed, and like network to be led by themselves in the field, where there is nobody is has his own priorities to take care of his family, to take care of staff. So I think we had 1,350 we call it community volunteers, and those were really developed through the 4 years to trained and received different training about leadership, about how to connect, how to use the local resources, how to utilize them, how to contact different civil societies within their communities to be able to build like a base for the resilience, taking into consideration that we have different volunteers from other negotiations. So through the 4 years, we tried to work on that. Of course, this could not be happen without understanding of the leadership, the top leadership. Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib is the leadership and the governance board, because in such situation, you don't need only the leadership of the volunteers. Also, the leaders of volunteers in the community, they need backup. So we had to work with, first of all, with the branches. Each branch has governance, a board, and also we had to work with them, with the framework, what we want to be, and their role as a leader in the community, to be the umbrella of the volunteers network in the community. So for me, from my experience, and also in Lebanon and Syria, from experience, leadership, it's not just a concept, it's the capability of everyone to do his work within his role. And it's not only responsibility of one person or achievement of one person. It is a contribution of different people within the structure of the society. As I said, because really, as a staff, we don't have the needed enough resources or capacity. As you know, we are 4,000 staff in all over Palestine Red Crescent societies inside and in diaspora, but with the 10,000 volunteers, really, we could reach the vulnerable people and help and support. Of course, also we couldn't do that without really support other national societies, sisters national societies and ICRC, because really the situation kept always demanding for and also this is another issue. Leadership is not only by the national society, but the partners in the movement really helped us to be able to reach and to build this resilience capacity with our volunteers in the different community and in different situations.
Okay, thank you very much, Khalida. I think that is a very important point that you made about how this is not a choice, we just have to do it. And I think the WISE data also spoke to kind of, similar sort of feelings about what I do and what I have done is not the result of any leadership training and development per se, but it is a result of 4 and 5 or 10 years of my experience of volunteering. So I think we need to kind of recognize volunteering as this emergent and evolving phenomenon rather than, as you said, as a concept, leadership as a concept. I think that is what you also said, it is an organic thing rather than as something that you can, just provide through training and development programs. Helena, I know your research is not specifically on volunteering, but what is your take on volunteering before we speak about Christoph's research at a little bit more depth?
I was just going to first quickly add on to what you said. I really agree with what you said, as I understood it from my perspective, sort of. Leadership has to follow from the bottom and up, but also from the top and down. So we need to have sort of hybrid systems. We need leadership on the personal level. Personal leadership is super important. And when I read the material that we were provided, I saw many examples of great personal leadership in these papers. For example, a female volunteer convincing her parents that she will actually go out of her community to stay in another community overnight. That takes great strength individually. So that's one level of leadership, I'd say. And then we have this team leadership, as I usually call it, like distributed leadership. That's another thing. And to get that, we of course need, how can I say, the individual leadership, personal leadership, to sort of aggregate to the group level. But then to do that, they also need the support from the national societies. And I also saw in these papers that I went through quickly before I came here that there were actually quite strong voices from the volunteers, what they need from leadership. I saw quite many examples where volunteers did not feel they had the adequate support or adequate resources to actually do their mission. I'm thinking particularly about the psychological trauma that many mentioned. So that's a leadership challenge for the national levels, to actually make sure that people have the PFA module, for example, psychological first aid, psychosocial support, not only to support themselves in the group, but also to be respectful towards the people they meet, to actually have these skill sets, sort of. And then, like you also mentioned a bit, Khalida, about sort of collaborative governance. Collaborative governance is one of my sort of research areas, and basically what it means is that, like you all know, today the conflicts and disaster situations are so complex. There are so many actors involved, high and low actors at all levels, communities, NGOs, state actors, and all need to work together somehow to get the most out of a mission, so to speak. And then we cannot have one leader to lead this, because we are many different organizations in this. Who's going to lead all of them? So then we need this distributed leadership again. I also wanted just to make one quick reference back to what you said. You talked about that you could like elect a leader, or you could actually just appoint a leader to a society. And that's, I think we also need to be careful to make a distinction between managers and leaders, because they are two different things. We can have a manager making sure budget is filled, making sure we have our strategies in place, making sure we do the reporting we should do. But a leader is a totally different thing for me. Yeah, that's just what I wanted to say.
That is a very valid point about how we need to kind of distinguish between managers and leaders. Wonderful. And with a room full of leaders, I think it will be unfair of me if I don't give you an opportunity to kind of come up with, if the panel hasn't already spoken about. Yes, please.
I think it's quite curious. I had the chance to be part of the General Assembly some weeks ago in Turkey. And having been there so many days reading policy papers, I think gets the best of you at some point. But then there's something very curious about Red Cross, Red Crescent policy, which is in every policy paper you hear about governance and you hear about management, but you never hear about volunteers outside the volunteering policy, really. Maybe the youth policy has an element of that. But then policy is made for governance and for management to work with it. But then it's not really meant to be for volunteers, from what you read on paper. Then it's very curious, because I love that concept. You might be able to give me some more information about the concept of collaborative governance, because within the Red Cross, we we are maybe not making the best of what we have in terms of leadership. We have governance, but then I don't really have anything to add, but just I have so many questions about when we have our governance, our boards, our local branch presidents. Are they really leaders, or are they just decision makers? Are they actually leading? And I think it's a very good question that we need to reflect on. We need to ponder on for a very long time. Then when we have leaders, like real leaders, that have the skills, that are able to lead their people, who are actually collaborative, when or how are they actually given the chance to be part of those governance structures at some point, to have that formal aspect towards their leadership? Because honestly, it's very hard when you have the skills and you have the leadership and you have the influence in a group, when you have so many good ideas that you're able to collect from a group in a collaborative manner, but you don't have the power to use them. So it's quite a good question. Then going back to Khalida's last comment, I really like it. In volunteering, which is my area specifically, we are, apart from everything that we worry about in the organization, in volunteering, you generally worry about retaining volunteers. So the question would be, maybe if we are aiming at this collaborative governance outside the movement, why do we really care about volunteers leaving? Isn't that a really good chance to foster volunteering outside that in the end is going to help us inside, because in the end we're all working together? So is it really a problem when a volunteer leaves? When you've given the volunteer the skills and the mindset and the values that volunteer needs to be a good leader, to be a good person in general outside the movement, it just feeds into the society and the communities in which you're working, and that just strengthens your work. It strengthens resilience in general. So I think we should really think about, are we really working? Are we really doing our part in fostering that leadership outside and in trying to transmit those fundamental principles outside the movement? And are we really using the right way to do this? I think there are many chances in, for example, our newly acquired youth policy, for example, in which we actually see that dimension of working with the externals. Do we really want to live in that little box, in that little bubble forever, or do we really want to explode and just let everything come out? So I think that was it.
I'm so glad we are having so many questions already, not at the end. So the session is going well. Eva, you have a point to make. Before that, you have a question, yes? I think we...
Because I think that is the most challenging. We need to have volunteer leaders, in response and other situations. Your question is also so very interesting, but I will come back to this, because my experience is that it's on lowest level is mainly difficult to find volunteer leaders. It's usually a volunteer position. It's a volunteer taking on responsibility because someone has to do it. And they are ready to volunteer a few hours a week. Then we start asking about all these skills and knowledge and everything. And I have often got a response, if you demand everything this from me, I quit. You have to employ me. You can't use me as a cheap labor because this is too comprehensive for a volunteer task. And there is lack of resources to employ leaders in most national societies that we are supporting. So this to find a realistic level of volunteer leadership as at the lowest level. What do you see as really key most important key components of leadership at that level? Maybe you in the Palestinian Red Crescent, that you have some experience from how you have capacity built these lower level volunteer leaders.
Shall I? Yeah. In fact, we learn from the experiences that we face and the challenges. To be honest with you, yes, we have this challenge. And we learned from our experiences that you need always a model. You have the model to be always there and to use it in leadership. And leadership does not come from training or giving the skills. No, this is the right way. It is really to use a model which is alive and acting every day, and that's why we also always we try to use our governance board to see who are really and we have many branches, strong branches. The outcome of the branches is really everybody can say they are satisfying with the outcome, and from the community themselves. And as I've mentioned, we are not alone in the field. We have different volunteers, we have different community, civil societies, UN, all of us together. What we try to learn, to do, or to explain to our volunteers that always we can't do everything by ourselves alone. Our main role, it is really to bring, since we believe in the resilience has to come from, to use the resources in local, so we have always to focus on to do networking, to communicate, to do our best really to help others. And this is the way really how we played a big role in disasters, in conflict, to bring many organizations together. And many times they don't know each other before, but as a facilitator, again, we believe that the leadership has to be to facilitate that everybody, all stakeholders, to work and to work together. And from my point also, when we talk about the leadership, it's not only about the president of the society, it's not only about the governance. Even the structure, even the management, as a program managers, how we will deal with the people from the technical side, with people, with the volunteers, with the staff, with the governance. Also, it's the other side of the management is leadership. So if we could together raise awareness of what does it mean leader and what the outcome will be, so we connect everybody within this issue. And to be honest, if, we found that really acknowledging the leadership skills in everybody and try to work on that and to support it, it becomes like something shared, and everybody will feel himself as individual, as organizational structure in the organization is a leadership, and will give you more and double achievements, double work to achieve the mission. And this is how we do work, in fact, at all different level of structures. But let me, towards what you said about mixing between the governance role and how they are collaborate. From my experience, I worked focusing on the governance issues and worked really with them together to develop guidelines for the roles of the governance and the roles of the volunteers. Sometimes not everybody, even the governance, because they have other things to take. They need to really oriented more and to communicate about what does it mean governance? What does it mean? It's different from management. Management is different from governance. Governance, they are the leader in the, so we tried to, in Palestine Red Crescent, because we need this differentiation, and we don't need an additional conflict inside to what we have already with our situation, but we worked together to develop, first of all, the guidelines, what's the role for each, and now we have also the youth volunteers. There is a mixing also between volunteers, youth volunteers and volunteer. So everything is getting more complicated. The best way, it is really to simplify, to go from complexity and to simplify each, and not only to simplify on document and to be on the cupboard, but really to disseminate and to train everybody, not only what's their role, but also others' role. What does it mean, volunteer? Inside, within programs, in the field, in conflict, I think we need to do this really to develop it and communicate with involvement all the stakeholders. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to understand all this issue. I know it's complicated, but we have really to structure and to work in details with everybody within the whole process.
Thank you, Khalida. Now, you may have seen that wonderful diagram there with a circle and a triangle, which Christoph will explain in a moment. Before that, just one more question, if I can just pass on that mic to just...
Yeah, I wanted to have a question building on the distinguish between management and leadership. Sometimes emergencies, large scale, happens in location where there is no well-functioning volunteer network. You could think about a branch office where managers are very strong in maintaining power, but doesn't have the skills to mobilize leadership and mobilize and motivate new volunteers. In the kind of design of a big program in that type of settings, what could be done to promote volunteer leadership at the kind of lower personal and level?
Good question. Christoph, would you like to
What could be
answer?
done? I mean, this is a question related to organizational and to human resources development. I mean, of course, local leadership can be built up, and be prepared also for different emergency settings which might occur based on a risk analysis. And I think that is extremely important, that the Red Cross acts also as a facilitator between local communities, authorities, other players, see what the capacities and risks are in a certain social structure, a community, and then come up with a plan for preparedness. And part of it is leadership and management training. And sometimes these roles have to be swapped depending on the situation. I strongly believe that good leaders can become good managers and vice versa. But I mean, there are some challenges in our Red Cross governance systems, but it depends also how self-confident volunteers are, how they demand for a clear representation, a mandate in their boards. But I believe it depends very much on the approach of the national society as a local player in a certain environment, in cooperation with authorities, other NGOs, the population, and how we play our role, not only as a service provider, but as a facilitator.
Would any of you like to?
Could I also comment? I believe, because this is a situation we usually come across, if not always. Generally, volunteer structures are so fluid that you cannot really pinpoint one specific leader in a particularly given branch, for example. So generally, when we start planning for a project, for example, we approach the branch and we work together with them to do whatever we have to do. Then generally what happens is in that specific case where you cannot really pinpoint one person to talk to, really, because no one really is leading anything there, then usually what you have are many grassroots volunteers that are scattered around and they don't really know what to do because they feel they have no one to guide them, basically. Dimensions are much more wide than that, but if you see it in a very broad way, that's what happens. Then what you really need to do is, as Christoph said, in many cases it works when you have a really good manager with good skills that can be somehow taking that role as a leader at some point. But generally, you know, management roles are not permanent. So we go back to the fact, or at least my strong belief, that everyone has a certain form of leadership. Everyone has a skill for leadership. They're all leaders. We are all leaders in a very different way. So you might not be the kind of leader that you might need or think you need for that specific program or project, but you do have leaders. So it's about exploiting, trying to identify what kind of leadership you can find within the group, and to be able to create an environment in which that specific kind of leadership that you have might be able to work. If you have like a more authoritarian kind of leader, that could definitely work for some time, for example, in order to be able to set up some structure. And then you might not have a very collaborative leader, but you have a leader that's, you know, someone who lets people just decide and do whatever they want. That could also work in some way. And so it's about knowing the types of leadership you can identify and knowing where each of them has their strength and being able to identify how to modify your programs and projects and your planning in a way that that specific kind of leadership might work. This is not set in stone. It's just how it's worked for us. But it's about being also flexible as managers and try to, and being willing to redefine the way you work so that you adapt to the volunteers you have and not the other way around. Because volunteers are scarce in most scenarios. So that might...
I see that we have so many questions, but I guess to kind of come back to your question, I think in Honduras we have a fantastic volunteer development manager, let us accept that, but there are also societies and countries where there is a gap in communication between national societies and branches and volunteers, and in those circumstances I think, you know, we need to also acknowledge this concept of informal leadership and how they do this on a regular and a daily basis. And I think we shouldn't forget that. Julian, the mic is there. Yes. Only burning questions are allowed at this point. So
only what?
Burning questions.
Burning questions.
Yes,
no, well,
you.
I have a question because of what we've just been talking about, the distance, sometimes geographical distance and difficulties in communication. How is technology helping leadership today in the field?
Silence.
No,
yes.
I would like to. In fact, the only way to keep in contact, communication with our colleagues in Syria and Lebanon, it's through the internet and the emails and all this. It is very helpful, to be honest with you. Even sometimes we could not. Syria is sometimes difficult, but at least we try to communicate, to do Skype, and it was very helpful. Even to send us some documents. So I think it also it gives support for them, for the management there, for the leadership, for the leaders, that they are not alone, that we are together. We used to also to do like conference meeting. Sometimes Syria it's difficult, but they have to go through to Lebanon, and we do conference, video conference, and we have to negotiate or to talk about everything related. So I think it really worked well and helped us a lot, and also helped others in addition to that, during conflicts in Gaza, the network of volunteers, we use this messages also for others to send, to move, or how to act within, to help each other in the field where there is nobody around. Also, it helped our volunteers, the network of that we have 1,300. It's really worked well with this texting and asking for help or sending some reports. So I think, but still, I think we need more regarding the technology to use it more in our work to be very helpful and supportive.
I would not like to monopolize the conversation, but it's so interesting. I love what you said, because I believe the main application of technology, as we generally think of it, is in communications. I think it's one of our very good strengths within the movement. However, I really like going back to the basics and really what is technology. Well, Delvin might be able to give us a little more insight on that, but I see technology not as computers. Computers are a part of technology. Internet is just like one bit of what technology really is. But technology, as a definition, is, I just searched it. I really don't know these things. The definition is the application of scientific knowledge. And so in that way, this is technology. So it's knowledge being applied. So for you to be able to have technology, you first need knowledge. And knowledge generally comes from a learning process. And learning processes can be done in so many ways. So basically, what we are doing right now, like generating knowledge, is somehow eventually seen as the application of this knowledge, and then in that way becoming technology. So I think it should be going back to the basics and seeing, well, how are we generating this knowledge? Are we being collaborative? Are we being innovative? Are we being creative about the way we do things? And that's technology also, even if you don't really have a computer or a smartphone, which is the case in our country still in some places. Not everyone has access to a smartphone or a computer or even telephones. So yeah, it's useful when you have like all these communication systems and apps and everything, but then that digital divide still is there, and it's something that we have to live with for some years, perhaps. But then how can we integrate the rest into this scheme of technology and then use all these computers and internet and apps and devices to be able to channel that knowledge and all that information across our volunteering corps?
Okay, thanks, Bessie. But I guess the question is really important in the sense that, you know, that gap between policy. We may have policies in place. We may have all the will in the world within the movement. We may have strategies in place. We're not short of that at all. But how do we bridge that gap between policy and practice, and how do we reach volunteers? I think that is a very important question, unless there are any more burning questions. And I'm going to give the floor to Christoph, who is going to talk about something that German Red Cross has developed for volunteer development leadership, right? Yeah, absolutely. Off to you.
I need more than 2 minutes.
3 minutes.
Okay. No, this based. It's about a new leadership development approach, which is based on a study we conducted in 2016. Interviewing 3,770 volunteers, how satisfied they are working in the Red Cross, and what do they expect from their leadership. And we looked at 4 dimensions, which I think are very useful and fitting very well into this model, which I describe sometimes as a leadership compass. And I want to start quickly mentioning them. And this is one which is functioning fairly well in the German Red Cross. This is the complex of tasks which volunteers are handling. No? Emergencies, social work, development situations in the society. And we have a very complex system of protocols, guidelines, tools, of course equipment, uniforms, and quality standards. Yeah? And these are a bit static, honestly. Some of them are 12, 15, 20 years old, and they have not been adjusted, but they are still used. Now, we are working in this equally shaped triangle, in a circle, in a changing society. So we are dealing what I call here the globe. And this is changing sometimes much faster than the Red Cross does, our environment. And some challenges we are facing is the fact that many German citizens are willing to volunteer, but more and more of them not in an organized way. They're willing to volunteer spontaneously outside bureaucratic structures in the neighborhood. They do something, bringing in their professionals and their private skills. And our organized volunteers are in many branches scared how to handle spontaneous volunteers, and that occurred definitely during the last big refugee crisis. And you may know Germany is taking one of the largest numbers of refugees in Europe, and we are still evaluating it, no? Based also on this concept. And a big thing is also the growing domestic insecurity. You remember, some of you may know, last Christmas we had the first bigger bomb attack, on a Christmas market where a truck in Berlin killed 30 people and about more than 100 were injured. And of course we had volunteers on the spot together with the police, the fire brigade, and it was not clear until a very late moment that this was a bomb attack and not a truck accident. And we really became very serious about new standards, how to handle here also the security of our volunteers together with the police and, if necessary, also the army. Now, another trend is that medical emergencies in our country are going down compared with psychosocial emergencies, which are going up drastically. That means the Red Cross has to change also, to a certain extent, the role and also the skills of our volunteers, which are medically trained in a perfect way, I must say. No? We have a law for that now. The skills for emergency first aiders, and it is excluding, unfortunately, more and more volunteers because the standards are going up. But the society needs people which can adjust quickly to migration situations, to evacuations, to bystanders and victims which have been psychologically affected by disasters, and we are weak at that. Now we come to what we discussed here. The volunteer, with his personal biography, the skills he's bringing to the Red Cross, but also his emotional and maybe health-related problems come with him, the family. And he can contribute a lot if we know him or her at an early stage. So matching is necessary. What does the volunteer bring? What does he or she want? What can the Red Cross offer? Which support do these volunteers need? And not all of our leaders are very good in empathy, under tolerating also cultural differences, and many of them, honestly, are not very well functioning under a longer-term stress situation. Some can act very professionally, when it comes to life-threatening situations for a couple of hours. But during this emergency crisis with the refugees, we discovered very clearly people were under stress for weeks, and the psychological support we provided was poor. Some took the traumas from the refugees home. And I'm working as a volunteer, as a psychological emergency counselor, and we had many, with traumatization and also with depressions and other symptoms. Now, aspect number 4 is maybe the most problematic, honestly. Teamwork takes place in Red Cross units, in training program, local branches, in boards, and it's based on good communication, on conflict resolution skills, definitely also on skills like project management. And we have discovered that many of our volunteers, more than about 30%, complained about lack of information, participation, and that the conflicts were simply pushed under the carpet. And that there is a phenomenon also of mobbing existing in Red Cross structures where difficult volunteers are not well taken care of or integrated. This is also related to a trend to racism, because in Germany it's very normal. Lower class people, which are from an unstable social background, join the Red Cross as volunteers, and they are scared of migrants. They believe migrants and refugees are taking away their jobs, etc., etc., and this is bubbling under the carpet. And we have some branches in the eastern part of Germany where it has become very serious, and we have set up a program to deal with racism in our own organization. Now, what is the conclusion? We have decided to put much more emphasis in our leadership development program on this side of the circle, the social skills, also cross-cultural skills, because technical skills are fairly well developed. But if we understand this circle as a dynamic system which is rolling like a ball, it has a strong overweight on this side, on the institutional and task-oriented side, task-focused side. And it is sometimes blocked here by the organization, its governance structures, and it is, we have discovered we are too inward-looking. And that makes us slow. And we need definitely leaders which can empower volunteers and act according to the situation and the emergency. Sometimes a more top-down driven structured leadership is necessary when it comes to life-threatening risks. And then people need to be able to switch back more to a development mode. And we know how difficult that is in international settings, but it's definitely also necessary in domestic settings. And another thing is this, I would say this circle skin, should not become too thick. Because sometimes the Red Cross is closing itself off. It is seen as a fairly elitist organization, at least in Europe. And it's sometimes very difficult to understand how it is functioning. You need sometimes a year or more to understand it fully. And we need to let fresh air in and monitor also what is happening around us. And then we come to what you said. I like this term swinging. If we are able to apply such a dynamic approach using these four aspects for monitoring and management, we can keep it in a balance, but in a flowing balance. And we have to be careful how much emphasis, how much attention, how much energy and resources are put in the different four dimensions. And I think this one here is an issue when we are discussing it here. There's high risk to underestimate here the importance, and because we're investing too much here, also on tasks given to us by our governments. And then it's also very important to empower teams and find the right leaders. So I try to be short, but I want to sell you this idea of a holistic leadership tool or approach, which is in a dynamic interaction also with its environment. So I'm sure you have some some reactions.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I think he alluded to a lot of things there about how contexts are changing, how organization is changing, how the volunteer demography is changing, and how we need to kind of restructure ourselves to be more relevant and more responsive to the situation. I'll take some questions. I'll give you the mic. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think this is really, really important, and especially looking at the volunteers and understanding also different kinds of dynamics that happens when people are put under extreme stress. And knowing WHO has a sort of
conflict or violence ecological model, where we know when people put under stress, we have different reactions. And the first one, I mean, reactions that we do have is actually anger, worry, and that can turn into violence, which means, and sort of the biggest threat is actually violence towards ourselves, different kinds of abuses. The suicide rate is actually the biggest death from violence in the world. It's not conflict at all, because that's sort of the lowest number. But aggression towards ourselves. And the second one is actually in our close relationships, domestic violence. And I think we need to actually put that up on the table, that what might happen is actually that our volunteers that has been put in stressful situations do turn against their families and their closest as gender-based violence, which is, of course, not a very something that, and we need to be aware of this. So I think that needs to be put on the table as well and actually speak about it.
Absolutely. I think there are some difficult questions that we need to ask ourselves. We have done a paper on trauma and psychosocial support, but again, I don't think we have addressed that, sort of turning that anger against themselves or to their family. That is something that I find really interesting, and we need to talk about these things. Are there any questions to Christoph before we go to Helena and hear about her research?
No, thank you. It's very interesting and linked to the volunteers' pressures, you can say. The team building is very important, from a psychosocial support perspective. You can see a well-functioning team is very supportive in especially stressful situations. Lena, can you comment anything? You mentioned team building as an important component in leadership perspective. Could you say something to add on this picture? You and Lena, maybe, because I think you have done some research. You can start, please, Christoph.
Just very short. I think team leaders have also a certain responsibility to use the resources which do exist in a group and to create a climate where team members can contribute. No? Of course, this is also related to the situation where and how you are working. No? And I think clear briefing and debriefing, immediate debriefing, after an activity is very important. And this is part of a learning approach, a learning culture. And in our society, it's unfortunately not very common to debrief after an action and then do another proper, maybe, lessons learned exercise a bit later. No? And I've observed that we are reinventing the wheel, no? On and on and on and on. I mean, knowledge sharing is tricky. No? Definitely, digital tools can be helpful. No? And then I think also sensitivity towards sensitivity for diversity is extremely important to practice and to learn. And then secondly, the common understanding of the task is a base for success. That the different individuals we are bringing together in an intervention understand the common task clearly. And that is again a question of clear communication. Clear communication. Without a task, a team, at least in the Red Cross, is not functioning very well. And if there are misunderstandings and intransparency right from the beginning, the team process will fail. No? And therefore, a team leader needs also to observe and watch how his members are reacting. Whether they have understood the task, whether they've accepted the task, or whether they've been forced to do something. No? And then, of course, check also the circle while you are working. How is the environment changing? So I believe good team building works if we have switched on 4 monitors. 4 monitors, and that can be trained. It takes some time, no? To listen to the others, to listen into myself, how I feel, use my emotional intelligence, and to listen also to the organization. And that is a question of, I call them key skills for leadership.
I think that came through the data very strongly about how volunteers felt like they are left alone to deal with different things, how they felt abandoned by the movement, or how to kind of, we focus on them during that crisis, but then what happens afterwards? They are left alone to deal with their own lives. The trauma is not something that, as you said, a short period of time, it kind of continues. So this is something that I guess we have to, as a movement, address. How can we build team? Which is, again, I think, part of leadership, isn't it? Helena, would you like to answer Eva's question before I take Lucy's?
Of course. I wrote down here just what you said about the material. Let's see here where it is. Vice volunteers frequently described relying on their capacity as individuals and groups rather than the wider infrastructure and systems of the national society. So this team is super important. And I mean, you mentioned now that team leaders have to, pay attention and be aware of their members, how they are feeling and so on. But also I think all the members of the team have to watch out for each other too, which of course, yeah. And I think also, actually there is an article, I don't remember the name of it. I think it's something like "My Job is a Disaster" or something like that. It's an interview study where the researcher has interviewed volunteers working in disaster contexts. Well, this case was a bit of both actually, disaster and conflict. And she was asking about the biggest stressors to their well-being, what they felt was the most difficult thing for them. And it was not seeing dead people, it was not being in a terrible place, not seeing your family. The biggest problems they had was actually within their working group. Mm-hmm. So to actually have a well-functioning working group is crucial, definitely. And then I would also just like to, very shortly, just be a bit careful about this, to immediately have a debrief after something happened, because the latest research, the reference center in Copenhagen with the psychological first aid shows that we should be a bit careful to have these immediate debriefs when the nervous system is sort of activated. We should not directly force or make people feel they have to talk about what happened. We need to sort of lower the stress first, and then we can talk about that. I just wanted to emphasize that. But you probably know much better than I do about these issues. Yeah, not emotional. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Lucy?
Interesting. I guess 2 connected questions. One was, I guess, sort of through this cycle, you've, I guess, alluded to it, but it suggests that you will continuously kind of check back in against each of these 4 kind of areas.
Maybe you can you repeat it?
Yeah. So one question is about how do you monitor how things change over time? So do you have a system of every 6 months, say, repeating the survey to check back against these areas to see what's changing? And the other question is about how is this situated within the German Red Cross? Because I guess this needs very high-level support. It's not just about volunteer leadership. Yeah. It's about how does the whole organization come together. So is this supported at the highest level?
Yes. Well, to review this every 6 months is too frequent. I mean, what we are now doing, and we have set also 23 minimal standards for local volunteer leadership and management, to try to do it every 3 years. To review also how satisfied volunteers are at a local level, how things are, moving, and of course after specific programs and campaigns, evaluations take place. But it depends very much on the setting. And I can say that our top leadership the national board has tasked me to review this or the leadership development curriculum. And they support the approach. It is, so to say, a dual system. Of course, we have a technical leadership curriculum, no? For medical emergency response, technical emergency response, yeah? Psychological support. This is separate from this system. These are the key skills for leaders of all programs, whether it's youth, social work, land rescue, mountain rescue, no? Focusing at the social competences. And the board has understood that this is a weakness. No? So they are giving us time to work on it, also with universities and training institutes. But now we are testing it, and we're starting with local governance. What do local board members need? What do volunteers need who join the board? That's number one. And the number two is volunteer coordination and conflict resolution.
Mag.
Okay, I've got a comment and a question. So I guess my comment is, please write a paper on this. So, I think it's really interesting, and maybe haven't thought about some of these issues before, so I think that would be really useful. I guess my question was, a lot of what we've been hearing, it sounds quite technical to me, technical approaches. And I think going back to some of the conversations from previous days and thinking about things like positionality and what this study was setting out to do, yeah, I think there are different ways in which we can engage volunteers. If you think about it as a spectrum, again, at the worst case, it's, you know, very extractive, it's very exploitative because volunteers are there, they can do the foot soldier work on the ground. And then at the other end, the ideal, which maybe we'll never get to, but you know, the idea with engaging with local volunteers is that they become agents of their own development rather than beneficiaries. So I think going back to earlier conversations about the volunteer charter and the movement, beyond the technical, what do you see happening, or what do you think needs to happen to really promote this idea of volunteers as leaders of aspects of work, and maybe you know, you need an institutional framework to manage that, whether, especially in conflict, looking at issues like security and safety, but a kind of slightly different way of working so that the leadership does come from volunteers themselves as a core asset and part of your movement. Does that make sense?
Fantastic, Kristen. Yeah, absolutely. I think that is very important. I mean, how to sort of balance that, to work within the existing framework, at the same time encouraging leadership to come and emerge from the grassroots level. How can you do that? How is that possible? Are you doing that in different ways already?
There's, as you said, Maggie, a policy component to it. You have to set the ground rules for who can be on the board and not. Specifically in our case as a national society, we have had to revise those and find out at some point that we were being too strict about who can be on the board and not. And we were asking for too much. I mean, you asked for like the lowest level governance structures, which are even below local boards. You were asking for 4 years experience and at least having started higher education, which is not really possible when you make you make a diagnosis of your volunteers and you find out that most of them only last in the organization for 4 years. I mean, so then if they're only there for 4 years, then after 4 years they can be part of the board, or they're never going to be part of the board. So you find that we're not really being coherent sometimes as national societies, and we're being too strict, and we're not actually opening the door for other people to be able to take this on. Then I think it also connects to Eva's comment some while ago. Like, do all volunteers really want to do this? Do they all want this responsibility? some might, but some might not. And we sometimes assume that because they're volunteers, they're going to be able, or they're going to want to be leaders, and that's sometimes not the case. And we also need to be very sensible about recognizing these people who might be capable of many things, but they are not willing to do it. They just want to give some time, they just want to give some effort, but they're not willing to give their life for it. And that's reality. So we need to be very sensible about this and really find out what, and speak to the people. What do you really want to do? Do you really want to be part of this? Because being in a leadership position, even though maybe not a governance position, requires a lot of time and effort, and sometimes even emotional drainage, which some people are not willing to go through. Then the other thing is, how much are we really asking of people in general? In my national society, we had in our rules for volunteers, we expected volunteers to give at least 8 hours of service a week, which is unreal. I mean, who of you would be willing to volunteer mandatorily for 8 hours a week?
Volunteer
You can't do it. So I mean, you don't have an extra day a week to be a volunteer. That's real life. People are expected to have jobs. People are expected, at least in national societies like mine, in which we have very strict policies about no remuneration whatsoever. If you are going to have those policies, you have to be coherent with them and allow people to have a job and livelihood in general. So we sometimes come into those contradictions that don't allow us to move further in terms of leadership. So I think that's the first thing I could recommend. Like, let's try to be coherent between what we are giving and what we expect to get.
But perhaps these frameworks are also too restrictive. That is why, as Christoph said, there is an emergence of informal and spontaneous volunteers who do not want to be part of an existing system that could be quite restrictive in that sense. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Now we're talking about the willingness of volunteers to become leaders. I'm just thinking that sometimes when you end up in emergencies or crisis, you'll find yourself in a situation where you have both staff members and volunteers. And sometimes there is a volunteer, very locally, very local, and knows the area, knows everything about the situation, who would be the most fitted one to be the leader of the response. But still, you have staff members coming in, trying to take over. So I think there might be a clash between these two different entities, like the staff and the volunteers. I mean, I'm talking about my own experience from the Swedish Red Cross now. So, what are your views on that? I mean, how can we actually overcome the situation? I mean, to really see who would be the most fit person to become the leader in this particular situation, in this particular place?
I would like to say also something after, I mean, replying to your remark about self-leadership. I mean, we must take a look also at the context where we are working and under which conditions, with which partners. Yeah? The Red Cross is an auxiliary to the government in many cases, especially during emergencies. We are working with partners and also according to certain standards set, for example, by the Ministry for Domestic Affairs or the Center for Civil Protection. And we have to interact with the police, with the fire brigade, etc. So without a certain hierarchy, it wouldn't function, and we wouldn't be taken serious. No? The other thing is, at least in our national society, people like to have also certain functions, and sometimes also their stars and stripes here. You know, whether that helps to perform better as a leader is another question. But it depends very much on the organizational culture and the structure. So I think we need to empower our volunteers and to promote learning and change within our organizations. And we need to be taken serious also by the external world.
Do you have any response to that question about the friction between staff and volunteers?
Yes, me. In fact, again, we have to be, the staff and the management are feel more responsible to their volunteers, and they have to be more aware that we should be always opened. And opened volunteers, as you've mentioned, he's here today or she is, and tomorrow they are not there. So I think as a manager, management responsibilities is to be more open to the volunteers, give them space, room to find themselves, where they could do and where they could be, discover the capacities of themselves as a leader or not. And our role, it is the management, their role is really to support and to provide the technical support if there is needed, and to facilitate the role of the volunteers in the community with the governance, with the other. This has to be clear and to be, and this does not come just from teaching once time. As I said, when you talk about development volunteers, it means not only the volunteer to be targeted, it has to be target the management and all over structure to understand what does it mean volunteer, how to deal with them, and not to be in competition between both of them. From my experience, yes, sometimes you'll find volunteers stay 24 hours in the operation room just to be and leave take off from their workshop. And this is really a point to acknowledge really volunteers who are really take holidays from their work to be just support their people in the operation room in the Palestine Red Crescent Society. And I think, again, to be a volunteer, it comes from the community and the situation and overall. We don't know just go and recruit people. No, they come and say, we want to be a part of PRCS volunteers to be able to support our family, our people in our community. And there is our role. It is to see how we can find. And when you talk about the mission of our as national society, the good thing that, and always we keep saying, anybody can find a place, because we work in different areas: health, emergency, humanitarian, IHL, everything. So you can mixture of different specialized people from outside would like to be part of the volunteer body. So I think we have to work more about how to be open, how to give more space to volunteers, and just not only when there's crisis we have to develop them. No, it is a long process, and being proactive than reactive. And this is what we learned from all of us in the migrations and conflicts, because there we always find ourselves as national societies in conflicts and in emergency, and where vulnerable people needs support and assistance. And this is our mission as national societies.
If I may add on to that, especially regarding Anders' question. I think it's a very good question that should be very easy to answer from the theory, but in the practice it's a completely different story. I do think, well, in Latin America we have a saying that you should be together but not mixed. And I think that sort of applies to the national societies, because when you have volunteers and staff working together, that will happen. When I think it should be about having specific roles and respecting those roles, and knowing how and when you can support each other. If you're on the field, you know that you're equally responsible for the general outcome of the activity or the initiative or whatever. But then each side, each part of or each corps has their own roles, and they're responsible for those roles. The fact that we're a team doesn't mean that we're all going to be doing the same thing. So I think that avoids those clashes between management that want to take over volunteers' roles and volunteers that want to be doing staff roles, because there are also legal liabilities and financial liabilities in some cases, which can only be assumed by a person that has a contractual relationship with an organization. And you cannot make volunteers liable for some things under the law. That will depend on every law, right? But I'm sure in Sweden you cannot assign certain roles to a volunteer also, because you cannot make them liable for this legally. And then it's about seeing, well, when is it my role and volunteers support me as a manager? And when is it the volunteers' role and I support the volunteers in their roles? So I think that, and respecting that and trying to make that relationship work, it's like marriage, but it should be something achievable at some point. Yeah.
Stefan is already giving me looks, but I'm going to ignore that and take 2 more questions because it's very interesting. Oh, no, 3. Madeline first, and then you, and then. Can we have a mic, please?
Thank you. I do understand that this is really an important question and that you need to have structures and systems in place and all that. But when we come to emergencies, when decisions needs to be taken, it's also important, and I relate back to the conversation about managers and leaders and the difference of the two. And also having the formal leader and informal, or a formal manager and an informal leader. And then what happens, especially if there is sort of, we need to act and react now. What will happen in that situation? So that's an interesting thing to discuss as well, I think about.
A point to ponder, I guess. Shall we? But I think that is a challenging situation, isn't it? It is about how we kind of balance that. We talk about crises and conflicts and emergencies when we can only do so much of preparation. We need to take decisions spontaneously. However, then if we need to talk about institutionalizing responses, then we are kind of restricting that space to be innovative and improvise. How do you balance that, Michael?
Thank you. Mine was really more of comment and contributing to then this dilemma of that leadership. From the practical experience is that one, there is a lot we could be able to borrow from the military practices. And this is where we bring in the incident command system. And therefore, the incident command system, one identifies that the first boot on the ground will take charge, and responsibilities will be transferred from one leader to another, depending on level of competence and not necessarily the rank. And so in Kenya, we've had even situations where the regulation is that the incident commander is the police. But where they do not have that competence, and the Red Cross person or a person from any other agency has better skill in handling that particular incident, that person remains the incident commander and the others follow.
Right.
And you can have, if you look at, I'm sure this incident command system is more of American, but there's a lot of learning that we can have there where you can have a joint command. It doesn't necessarily also mean always that the incident commander makes all the decisions alone. You can have a joint command where you have several people sitting in that command and making decisions. That way you avoid the conflicts. And of course, if you had the first boot on ground as being just the volunteer who is on ground and whom you are able only to communicate, they can only send you possibly images if you are lucky. Otherwise, you just find a way of communicating with them, giving instruction and guidance where necessary, and until when you get there or when the next competent person gets to the ground. And if by the time you get to the ground, for example, if I am not an engineer per se, and if the issue that we're dealing with requires an engineer, and it's the volunteer engineer who is on ground, then I'll back him up. So that is, I think, one of the things is that we can develop that that kind of system. We've tried it, and it works. The other bit is also on that we've come up with responsibilities that are quite clear, regardless of the circumstances that you will be dealing with, and is anchored on. For us, we've done a mass casualty incident management protocol that the Red Cross developed, supported by the government, but we were the brainchild of that. But then the government now takes responsibility on any mass casualty incident, giving specific leaderships. And the Red Cross has been given the specific role of dealing with healthcare issues and emergency evacuation. If we are the first boot on ground, we will of course do the search and rescue. If we have resources, we can support, but that is not our core thing. Our core area is health and the emergency evacuation. You need ambulance, you need people to be extricated and taken to hospital and followed up, psychosocial support. That is our key role in all the operation. And there is someone else who has been, if you have a collapsed building, the Ministry of Public Works, the engineer, is in charge, and even if you're bringing in the military to come and help, it is not their responsibility. The in charge is the civilian ministry. So I think these are the two areas that we can borrow from. The mass casualty incident protocols, if we don't have them, we can be able to develop that, and the incident command system. Thank you.
Do I have time to take 2 more questions, or no? No? Yeah. Is that, I'm so sorry about that. But I guess your point about, that willingness to learn where the skills are, where the competencies are, and kind of, make them leaders perhaps is a very valid point. But I guess as a session, one thing that strikes me is how interconnected these issues are. I think we started with leadership, and we spoke about resilience and psychosocial support and all sorts of things. So it is not an isolated thing that we need to talk about, and we need to integrate with the other themes that we are already talking about. And I apologize because I couldn't give Helena a little bit more time to talk about her research, but we did hear a lot of interesting things from her. I thank the panel. It was wonderful to hear from all of you, and I think we have learned quite a lot from their experiences. And I thank you all for your comments and questions. And please keep the conversations going. And we know we have our emails, I think, in here. So please, keep that connection going so that we can genuinely make this a collaborative learning experience beyond these 3 days. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This ends the 2 discussions. The last discussion was a long discussion. It's actually longer than a normal movie. So there will be some cinematic experiences on YouTube later on where you can revisit what's happened. The group is shrinking, and we're going to take just a 5-10 minutes break, stretch the legs, get some air, get 10 minutes. Yeah. No, not 15, 10. Yeah. Get back in here, and we will just look at the future. Thank you.
Before we leave for the break, Julian has a very important point to make about leadership. I think that is very important. We need to...
Leadership for me, and having worked under all sorts of different leadership styles, for me, the most important thing in leadership and the real difference between a leader and a manager is ego and humility.